Welcome once again to the Emmanuel Grace Lectureship. We're delighted to see you here tonight, especially in view of the terrible weather, and we hope that this event will be the first of many, hopefully under better conditions. This program is a cooperative effort of Emmanuel Lutheran Church and Grace Episcopal Church, following an initiative from Emmanuel Church. Our goal has been to offer innovative thinking and a welcoming space for informed dialogue. The steering committee includes members of both churches, mostly lay people and a few clergy. And while it would take too long to recognize every contribution, I do want to acknowledge the chairperson who brought us together and has kept us going, Ruth Renard. When we invited Professor Dorrien to inaugurate this series, we were looking for an informed perspective on issues that concern us as religious people today. We wanted to offer resources with deep grounding and with generosity and spaciousness of thought, both for Christians and for the wider community. All of this we were confident we had found. What we didn't know was that in the time between the invitation and the event, a movement would arise calling for economic justice and democratic renewal, challenging corruption and the excessive accumulation of wealth. As a nation, we have been here before. Professor Dorrien knows this and knows what issues are at stake. So we feel very fortunate in our choice of speaker. Dorrien is the Reinhold Niebuhr Professor of Social Ethics at Union Theological Seminary and Professor of Religion at Columbia University. He was previously Distinguished Professor of Religion and Dean of the Chapel at Kalamazoo College. His published work includes 14 books and numerous articles, and he has also contributed to Religion and Ethics News Weekly, Bill Moyer's Journal, and other venues of public discussion. Among his most notable works are a magisterial history of American liberal theology, which teaches us something of the depth and diversity of that intellectual tradition, and a broad and deep historical study of the field of social ethics. His most recent book is Economy, Difference, Empire, Social Ethics for Social Justice. He has commented on, among other things, the Iraq War, neoconservative thought, and the healthcare system, and has also written on philosophy, theology, and not least, spiritual life and the lure of divine love. We anticipate a most interesting evening. Professor Dorrien.
As it was rolling along, I just suddenly had a remembrance of something. I have a good friend, Daniel McGuire. Perhaps some of you have heard of him. He's a quite prominent Roman Catholic ethicist, pretty radical. And he once gave me some sage advice. Daniel said, Gary, if you ever find yourself feeling mildly depressed, just feeling like your life isn't amounting to much of anything, just find a way to get yourself introduced. So I'm finding it's working for me. Thank you, Patty. It's a great delight for me to be here tonight, to be reunited with my treasured friends, Rudy and Shirley Nelson. Just seen an old friend, Andrew Dole, here, who teaches at Amherst College. I do want to say a word of apology. It could be there's some people out here who know my theological work. About half of my work is in theology and philosophy, and the other half is in social ethics and politics. And when we talked about what I might do here tonight, a couple months ago, a very quick verdict was made. We want you to go social, ethical, political, and leave theology, to another occasion. So that's what's going to happen. That might actually disappoint, one or two people here, but that's what we're doing. My subject is the economic crisis of our time. the vision of economic democracy expounded by the social gospel movement of a century ago, and the relevance of economic democracy today. The idea that Christianity has a mission to transform the structures of society in the direction of social justice is distinctly modern. It is a product of the social gospel movement, the greatest surge of social justice activism ever waged by the mainline churches in this country. I am not saying that Christianity had no social ethic before the modern era. The idea that Christianity has a regenerative social mission is as old as the biblical message of letting justice flow like a river and pouring yourself out for the poor and vulnerable, and attending to what Jesus called the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy. I am just emerging from pneumonia. You're going to hear it every now and then. I'll just have to catch and get my voice back. In this country, the great evangelical and liberal movements of the 18th and 19th centuries were rife with temperance, anti-slavery, anti-war, and other social causes. But the progressive era introduced something new to American Christianity. In the early 1880s, proponents of what came to be called the social gospel invented the field that I teach, social ethics, and the ecumenical movement. It was not a coincidence that the social gospel, social ethics, sociology, socialism, social Darwinism, and the very ideas of social structure, social salvation, and social justice all arose at the same time. Also, corporate capitalism and the trade unions. For the social gospel was essentially a North American version of the movements for Christian socialism that arose in Europe in the late 19th century. It was based on a doctrine of social salvation, which was based on the emerging sociological idea of social structure, which gave rise to the very idea of social justice. In the social gospel, society became a subject of redemption. Social justice became intrinsic to salvation. If there was such a thing as social structure, redemption had to be reconceptualized to take account of it. Salvation had to be personal and social to be saved. The social gospel happened for a confluence of reasons that impacted each other. It was fed by the well springs of Enlightenment humanism, the abolitionist movement, and the home missions movement. It took root as a response to the corruption of the Gilded Age and the rise of industrial society, goaded by muckraking writers. It took inspiration from the Christian socialist movement in England, which was mostly Anglican. It rode on the back of a rising sociological consciousness and literature, the emergence of sociology as a field. But above all that, the social gospel was a response to a burgeoning labor movement. Trade unionists blasted the churches for doing nothing for poor and working class people. Christian leaders realized it was pointless to defend Christianity if the churches took an indefensible attitude on that issue. In this country, 3 Episcopalians became major figures in the social gospel movement: Richard Ely, W.D.P. Bliss, and Vita Scudder. The Methodist Church was slow to join the social gospel, but after it did in the early 20th century, it became the most active denomination of them all in the movement, practically taking it over, under the leadership of Harry Ward, Frank Mason North, Mary McDowell, and Francis McConnell, who made bishop. But the movement's 2 greatest figures were Washington Gladden, a Congregationalist, and Walter Rauschenbusch, a Northern Baptist. For them, the social gospel was political, without apology, with a progressive ideology, and vibrantly evangelical in a theologically liberal fashion. In every way, Washington Gladden represented the movement's mainstream. He spoke the language of idealistic moral progress to the end of his life. He advocated liberal theology, liberal internationalism, and worker ownership. He passionately opposed World War I right up to the moment that the U.S. intervened, whereupon he embraced the war to end all wars, even preaching sermons on, yes, making the world safe for democracy, and he was never dangerous. Every Sunday morning he preached on personal religion, and every Sunday evening he preached about economics, militarism, and social religion. On the first Sunday of every year, Washington Gladden preached a sermon on the ways that America and the world had improved over the past year. That's progressive. But Walter Rauschenbusch was more radical and more galvanizing. He began his ministerial career in 1886 at the Second German Baptist Church of New York on West 45th Street, near 10th Avenue. There, on the northern edge of what back then was called Hell's Kitchen, the real estate people have renamed it since then, Rauschenbusch served a poor, hurting immigrant congregation, and he converted to the social gospel. He later recalled that when he came to New York, he had no concept of social Christianity or social anything. Rauschenbusch's searing encounter with urban poverty, especially the funerals that he performed for children, drove him to social activism. Politics became unavoidable. If people suffered because of politics and economics, and the church had to deal with politics and economics. He later recalled that during his early ministry, he had 6 books in his head. 5 were scholarly, 1 was dangerous. 3 times he tried to write the dangerous one, but he had to put it aside. And every time that he came back to it, he found he'd outgrown the thing, so he had to start all over again. In 1891, he decided, with deep sadness, that he was going to have to resign from the ministry because he was going deaf. A surf-like roar in his ears made it very difficult to do pastoral tasks. For the rest of his life, Rauschenbusch called it physical loneliness. He was offered his father's teaching position at Rochester Theological Seminary, but he doubted that teaching would work any better than ministry for a deaf person. He decided to go abroad for a year, write the dangerous book, and launch a literary career. His very loving congregation insisted instead on a paid sabbatical, which he took in Germany. There he labored on a book titled Revolutionary Christianity, which argued that Christianity should be essentially revolutionary in the manner of Jesus. Jesus proclaimed a post-millennial idea of the coming reign of God, and the church is supposed to be a new kind of community that transforms the world by the power of Christ's kingdom-bringing spirit. Rauschenbusch argued that the kingdom of God is not merely part of Christianity. It's the central thing holding everything else together. It includes the heavenly afterlife, the presence of God in every human soul, the church as the body of Christ, the divine commonwealth to be built on earth, and the promise of an eschatological end of history, a transhistorical deal standing outside of history. He stressed that this idea is beautiful, comprehensive, filled with justice-making, social, ethical content, and it's evangelical. Here is a concept that embraces everything. Here is something so big that nothing is excluded from it. Wherever I go, he would say, whatever I touch, there's the kingdom of God. It carries God into everything that you do, and it has the authority of the Lord Jesus in it because it was Jesus' own central concept. But the year passed. The book never quite came together. Rauschenbusch returned to his congregation, and the following year he married a school teacher, Pauline, who helped him cope with his worsening deafness. They made pastoral calls together. Expressions of love and affection passed easily between them, and their marriage was a sustained love affair, one that pulled him out of his depressive spiral. The next time that Rochester Seminary called, in 1897, he felt that, well, maybe I could handle an academic career. And so he did, carrying on his father's work in the German department, which he did for 5 years, teaching English and American literature, physiology, physics, civil government, political economy, astronomy, zoology, the New Testament, all in German, all in addition to raising money for the German department to keep it going. This exhausting regimen left no time at all for his own work, and the German-American community that he served was almost completely hostile to the social gospel. Finally, in 1902, the seminary's position in church history opened up, and that is why the greatest works of the social gospel have such a strong historical bent. Walter Rauschenbusch made his living as a professor of church history. While learning a new field, he spoke at civic groups and churches about the social gospel. He helped to organize the Federal Council of Churches, and he started thinking again about that big, dangerous book. He went back to his sprawling manuscript to see what he could find, and he did find a few things, especially the starting point: Jesus and his kingdom. That was the basis for a mostly new book that he finished in 1907, Christianity and the Social Crisis. The first part described the essential purpose of prophetic biblical religion as the transformation of human society into the commonwealth of God. The second part explained why the church had never carried out this mission. The third part urged that it was not too late for the church to actually follow Jesus. The book had a blazing manifesto for democratic socialism, which Rauschenbusch feared would get him fired. And he argued that every chapter of church history could be titled, "How the Kingdom of God Was Misconstrued in This Era," or replaced by something else. Revolutionary Christianity, the manuscript, had patches of labored writing and clumsy connections, but all was smooth and sparkling in Christianity and the Social Crisis. The book enthralled a huge audiences with its short, clear sentences and its charming metaphors and its very vigorous pace, even faster than I'm going right now. For Rauschenbusch, the rise of corporate capitalism marked a crisis for American civilization, but also an opportunity to recover the lost kingdom ideal of Jesus. If production could be organized on a cooperative basis, if distribution could be organized by principles of justice, if workers could be treated as valuable ends in themselves, if parasitic wealth could be abolished. This fantasy of ifs went on for 2/3 of a page in one sentence. If all these things could be accomplished, he wrote, it might be possible, quote, to actually live a Christian life without retiring from the world. Well, that was an idealistic fantasy. But instead of getting fired, Rauschenbusch returned from another sabbatical in Germany to find that his book was a supercharger for a rising social gospel movement. This movement as a whole had many faults and limitations. A great deal of the movement was sentimental, moralistic, idealistic, and politically naive. It preached a gospel of cultural optimism and a Jesus of often middle-class idealism. It spoke the language of triumphal missionary religion. Sometimes it actually baptized the Anglo-Saxon ideology of manifest destiny, and it usually claimed that U.S. American imperialism is not really imperialism because it has such good intentions. The social gospel helped to build colleges and universities for African Americans, but only rarely did it summon the courage to demand justice for blacks. It supported suffrage for women, but that was the extent of its feminism. Most social gospel leaders vigorously opposed World War I right up to the moment we went in, whereupon they promptly ditched their opposition to war, and then after war, so many of them overreacted and repented by reducing the social gospel to pacifist idealism. In the 1930s and 1940s, Reinhold Niebuhr blasted the social gospel for many of these things. Niebuhr taught, wrongly, that the social gospel had no doctrine of sin. And he taught, more justly, that it was too idealistic to be a serious force in power politics. After Niebuhr's generation had passed, liberation theologians judged that the social gospel and Christian realism were both too middle-class, white, male-dominated, and socially privileged to be agents of anything worthy of being called liberation. Yet the social gospel, for all its faults and limitations, has the greatest legacy of any American religious movement. Christian realism inspired no hymns, and it built no lasting institutions. It was not even a movement, but rather a reaction to the social gospel centered on one person, Reinhold Niebuhr. The social gospel, by contrast, was a 60-year movement, an enduring perspective that paved the way for ecumenism, social Christianity, the civil rights movement, and the deep involvement of the ecumenical movement in the civil rights movement. It had a tradition in the black churches led by Reverend E. Ransom, Ida Wells Barnett, Benjamin Mays, Mordecai Johnson, all of whom gave way to Martin Luther King Jr. It created the ecumenical and social justice ministries that remain the heart of American Christianity. And it expounded a vision of economic democracy that is every bit as relevant and necessary today as it was a century ago. To put it in contemporary terms, social gospel was a response to the first historic wave of what we today call economic globalization, the clash between a burgeoning corporate capitalism and a rising labor movement. Most social gospelers advocated cooperatives and community ownership. A more radical group, following Rauschenbusch, advocated decentralized democratic socialism. A third group advocated state socialism and state planning. They included George Herron and Vita Scudder. In the 1930s, a fourth group came along that blasted all the social gospel groups for being too idealistic and moralistic. Reinhold Niebuhr was their leader. The Niebuhrian realists in the 1930s were all radical state socialists. Wrongly, they equated socialization with nationalization. Wrongly, they rejected production for profit, and they wanted government planners to organize an economy not linked by markets. Niebuhr blasted the New Deal throughout the 1930s. Then he changed his mind. He joined the mainstream of the Democratic Party, and he stopped calling for economic alternatives. On these issues, Rauschenbusch ended up looking better than the radicals that panned him for being too idealistic. He assumed that markets cannot be abolished in a free society. Shouldn't even want to. He understood that state planners cannot replicate the pricing decisions of markets. And he urged that we need to get as much as we can out of worker and community ownership. To be sure, he was idealistic. But his theology for the social gospel had 7 chapters on sin, culminating with a powerful chapter on the kingdom of evil, a far more powerful collective concept than anything you can get out of Reinhold Niebuhr. And he warned that idealism alone never changes anything. Quote, "We must not blink the fact that idealists alone have never carried through any great social change. The possessing classes rule by force and long-standing power. They control nearly all property. The law is on their side, for they have made it. To succeed, a given truth must depend on a class which makes that truth its own and fights for it." Well, that's not the sentimental idea of the social gospel that Reinhold Niebuhr peddled for decades. That was the response of the social gospel to the story of its time, the rise of corporate capitalism and the union movement. The story of our time is that corporate capitalism has conquered the world. The common good has been getting hammered for 30 years, and we need an upsurge of progressive social forces to hold corporate capitalism and the political right in check. At least that. Global capitalism commodifies everything that it touches, including labor and nature, putting everything up for sale. Nothing is exempt from the pressure of competition. Social contracts have vanished under threats of obsolescence and ruin, while the global market exploits resources, displaces communities, and sets off wealth explosions and wild cycles of boom and bust. The debates that we are having today about busting public unions, cutting Medicaid, and privatizing Medicare, for goodness sake, are byproducts of 30 years of economic globalization and of massive structural and, to a great degree, politically engineered inequality. Wages have been flat for 35 years, and inequality has worsened dramatically. The share of America's income held by the top 1% has more than doubled since 1982, and that's no accident. Today, the top 1% of the U.S. population holds 39% of the wealth and takes in 25% of the nation's income. Just utterly staggering figures. The top 10% of the population hold more than 70% of the wealth. The bottom 50% hold 2% of the wealth. That's not just economic globalization. You've got to have bad politics to produce figures of that sort, to get anything remotely like that. The crash of 2008 wiped out $8 trillion of home value. The banks that frothed it up are sitting on $2 trillion of cash. They salted away their bailouts and went back to gambling in the swaps market, which pays so much better than making boring investments in the real economy. And now we're told that we'll have to break our social contract with the poor and the elderly, turning Medicare into a voucher system. Wall Street has recovered nicely, but we have 9% official unemployment, upwards of 20% real unemployment, with higher figures in African American communities. Corporate profits are soaring again, but our corporations don't really need us anymore because over half their revenues and profits come from abroad. Every trade deal that we have signed has resulted in jobs leaving the United States. Meanwhile, public services are being slashed in every state of this supposedly advanced nation. An executive is said to be a great success if he slashes his payroll and he makes bigger profits. But what kind of success is that? For the past 25 years, the best-selling books about globalization have told us to forget about changing the system. Tom Friedman, a celebrant of the second wave, calls it turbo-capitalism. In the academy, turbo-capitalism is usually called neoliberalism. Economic globalization, the integration of national economies into the global economy through trade, direct foreign investment, short-term capital flows, and flows of labor and technology has flattened the world. Friedman says, in a flat world, you either compete successfully or you're run over. According to neoliberals, global capitalism reduces national politics to minor tweaks. There is no third way in political economy anymore. There isn't even a second way. Any nation that wants a growing economy has to wear a one-size-fits-all golden straitjacket that unleashes the private sector, keeps inflation low, minimizes government, eliminates tariffs, deregulates capital markets, and allows direct foreign ownership and control. Once a nation takes this path, Friedman says, its political choices just get reduced to Pepsi or Coke, to slight nuances of taste or policy. Tiny alterations to account for local traditions. A little bit of loosening here or there, but never any real deviation from what he calls the core golden rules. Friedman wants the U.S. to spend more on green technology and science education. He's very good on environmental issues, especially recently. But he tells us to give up on nostalgic dreams of anything resembling social justice. Neoliberals exaggerate the futility of attempts to channel economic forces. Contrary to the story that they tell, the U.S. did not ensure its prosperity by donning the golden straitjacket and relinquishing its manufacturing base. From the late 1940s to the mid-1970s, productivity and wages soared together in this country, creating a middle class. Meanwhile, there were no bank crises, as New Deal reforms kept commercial banks out of the investment business. But wages flattened in the mid-70s, productivity kept soaring, and commercial banks got deeply into the investment business. The rich got fantastically richer while everybody else fell behind, taking on debt to keep from drowning. During this period, nearly every manufacturing society outperformed the U.S. in income growth, and they did so with more equitable distributions of income. Why did it happen differently in this country? Well, in the 1980s, the United States cut the marginal tax rate from 71% to 28%. And we cut the capital gains rate from 45% to 20%. Of course, now we've got it down to 15, and let's talk about abolishing it altogether. These measures had an enormous impact on the kind of country that we became, fueling a huge surge for inequality. Then the global integration of two radically different models of growth, debt-financed consumption and production-oriented export and saving, created a wildly unstable world economy featuring asset bubbles and huge trade imbalances. For 20 years, apologists for turbo-capitalism and radical critics agreed that governments are passé in this area. But then the housing market crashed, and these supposedly obsolete governments ponied up $13 trillion in 2 months to save capitalism from itself. From the perspective of Economics 101, every bubble mania is basically alike. But from the beginning, this one has been harder to stomach and to swallow. Because it started with people who were just trying to buy a house of their own, who had no concept of predatory lending, who had no say whatsoever in the securitization boondoggle that spliced up various components of risk in order to trade them separately. It seemed a blessing to get a low-rate mortgage. It was a mystery how the banks did it, but this was their business. You trusted that they knew what they were doing. Your banker sold the mortgage to an aggregator who bunched it up with thousands of other subprime mortgages, chopped the package into pieces, and sold them as corporate bonds to parties looking for extra yield. Your mortgage payments paid for the interest on the bonds. For 20 years, securitizations and derivatives were great at concocting extra yield and, especially, allowing the banks to hide their debt. Broadly speaking, a derivative is any contract that derives its value from another underlying asset. But more narrowly, it's an instrument that allows investors to speculate on the future price of something without having to buy it. Credit default swaps are private contracts that allow investors to bet on whether a borrower will default. 12 years ago, that market was $140 billion. Today, it's $65 trillion. And that's the heart of the meltdown. AIG's derivatives unit was just a huge casino, selling phantom insurance with virtually no backing that now we have to pay for. The tally just for AIG, 4 bailouts totaling $185 billion, some rather hard-to-take bonus payments, and no bottom in sight for a sinkhole of toxic debt exceeding $1 trillion. Next year, speculative corporate debt in this country is going to explode, as the reckoning for high-risk loans, bonds, and leveraged buyouts transacted 4 to 6 years ago is going to occur. In the bond business, this is called a maturity wall. This year, over $50 billion is coming due for junk bonds that were sold before the credit crisis hit. Next year, that number will soar to over $160 billion. The following year, it will be at least $220 billion. The year after that, it will be over $350 billion. This coming avalanche of over $750 billion of speculative debt was created just like the mortgage crisis, with CDOs that sliced and diced corporate loans, and all of it is going to come due at a time when, as all of us surely know by now, the U.S. government is going to need to borrow another $2 trillion to make its payments. Another credit crunch is coming, and we still haven't solved the bank problem that the Obama administration inherited. Today, the big banks are still holding about $2 trillion of toxic debt. But their bailouts have made them feel better. Their profits are way up. They've fought every reform in the Dodd-Frank reform bill. They're back to gambling in the swaps market. And they're spending $50 million per quarter to obliterate what reforms did get through with the Dodd-Frank process. When Obama took office, there was a lot of talk about the bad bank model, which creates transitional banks to soak up the toxic debt. Here, there's a risk of getting prices wrong. If the government overpays for toxic securities, taxpayers are cheated. If it doesn't overpay and the banks take mark-to-market prices, some banks could go under. Some advocates of the bad bank strategy said, well, the government could just stall on the price issue and wait till values rise, which is what the Germans did. But to the FDIC, that smacked of alchemy, floating assets into the ether. And so Tim Geithner settled on what he called an aggregator bank, which blends the original Henry Paulson plan, cash for trash, with some elements of the bad bank, all of it topped off with an auction scheme. Our government is spending $1 trillion subsidizing up to 95% of deals partnered with hedge funds and private equity firms to buy up the toxic debt. Of all the possible strategies to deal with this problem, this one is the most cumbersome and non-transparent. And it coddles the banks. It is utterly obsequious to Wall Street. It's based on the dubious hope of finding enough private investors to buy rotten goods. It offers a taxpayer guarantee to investors that they won't lose any money if they get in. Essentially, it's a scheme to bribe private investors to buy the bad assets for more than they're worth, which the banks are resisting anyway, since they just want to go back to gambling without government interference. Today, 7 banks control 66% of the nation's assets. 15 years ago, that figure was 18%. That's the path we're on. Our government, by paying off the very people who created this disaster, has made them more powerful than ever. And the person who cut the bailout deals with the banks and played matchmaker for their mergers is Obama's Treasury Secretary. Last year, we had a chance to break up the mega banks, thanks to Sherrod Brown. The Brown-Kaufman amendment to the Dodd-Frank bill would have capped the size of the mega banks, allowing no bank to risk more than 3% of the nation's GDP or to hold more than 10% of the nation's total in insured deposits. These caps were large enough to allow effective economies of scale. And had the Brown-Kaufman amendment gone through, it would have broken up the 7 largest banks. In the Senate, it won 30 Democratic votes and 3 Republican votes, despite failing to win the support of the Obama administration or the Senate Democratic leadership. Brown-Kaufman would have passed had Obama supported it. According to Obama, the Volcker rule was a better way to restrain the speculative excess of the big banks. But then we didn't get the Volcker rule either. Not really. In 1999, the Clinton administration teamed with Bill Graham to tear down the Glass-Steagall wall between commercial and investment banking, which opened the door to the mega bank empires and mergers of the Bush years. It was a big deal when Obama announced that he supported Paul Volcker's proposal to reinstate the wall between commercial and investment banking. The federal government provides deposit insurance and other safeguards to ensure that we have a stable banking system. These privileges were not created to give an unfair advantage to banks who operate hedge funds or who have private equity funds. Banks should not be allowed to speculate with cheap money that government shelter provides. And worse yet, the current system allows banks to make trades conflicting with the interests of their own customers, which has fueled a riot of speculation. The Volcker rule was the centerpiece of the Dodd-Frank bill. This was not mere technocratic tinkering. This was using political power to change the system. And it helped that the Dodd bill moved through the Senate at the very same time that the SEC filed a civil suit against Goldman Sachs for misleading investors in a big CDO deal. Goldman, as you may recall, was routinely shorting, that is, betting against CDOs that it created and marketed to investors. A showcase example of the very kind of double dipping that Volcker is trying to prevent. According to the SEC, Goldman took a further step in this process in its Atticus 2007 deal by creating a derivative that was designed to fail at the request of one client, John Paulson, who wanted to bet against it. Paulson is the head of a giant New York hedge fund. He's made billions betting against the housing market. The SEC said that Goldman misled its investors by not disclosing that Paulson handpicked the very bonds that were underlying the derivative. And Goldman's position was that it had no obligation to do so. This case proved enlightening to many people who were just beginning to pay attention to what Wall Street has done to us. The ostensible purpose of Wall Street is to raise money to finance making things in the real economy. But CDO deals are not investments. They don't create any actual bonds or mortgages. They don't add anything of value to society. They are pure gambling on whether somebody else's bonds will succeed. They inflate the housing bubble without financing a single house. They're like side bets at a casino, except in this case, the Federal Reserve implicitly protects all these bets. Moreover, according to the SEC, Goldman looted its own customers. And last week, you may have noticed that they said, well, actually, Citigroup has done something way beyond what even Goldman was doing. Goldman settled its fraud charges for $550 million back at the time, and a strong version of the Volcker rule almost made it to the finish line. But in the end, the Dodd-Frank bill could not pass. Does anyone know here how this story turned out, where I'm going with this? I have added this part just for you. The reason the Volcker rule didn't make it through the Senate is Obama had to buy one more vote in it, and yes, it was Scott Brown's vote, whose price for his vote was to gut it, demanding exemptions for all government-backed entities and municipal bonds and treasury bonds. And as usual, once you've drilled 3 or 4 holes into something, that gives way to more. Volcker's original proposal was 3 pages long. The Volcker section of the Dodd-Frank bill ended up being 10 pages long because of Scott Brown. And since then, because of all the more drilling that's gone on, it's now up to 300 pages. There are some good things in the Dodd-Frank bill. It requires most derivatives to be traded on a public exchange and cleared through a third party. It expanded the authority of the Fed. It established a new consumer agency. It authorized regulators to impose higher capital reserves. That's a huge issue. These were significant victories over an overwhelmingly better funded opposition. But the lobbying and political opposition riddled the bill with poison pills and loopholes, especially carve-outs for corporate users of derivatives, exemptions for foreign exchange swaps, and restricted scrutiny of pension funds. Its heavy reliance on the Fed is a mixed blessing at best, as the Fed is very friendly to the big banks, and the new Consumer Protection Agency is housed there. The bill does not require higher capital reserves or abolish gambling with CDOs. It took a pass on the biggest problem of all, that the ever-growing too-big-to-fail banks are too big to be regulated too. And now Wall Street has gutted the Dodd-Frank measures on the Volcker rule and on debit card fee caps and on oversight of complex derivatives. It also got in the way of hiring the person who was supposed to run the Consumer Protection Agency, although Massachusetts may have something to say about how this guy turns out. Simon Johnson, until 3 years ago, was chief economist of the International Monetary Fund. He argues that the finance industry has effectively captured our government. During his early career at MIT, Johnson tried to be skeptical about this, but then he went to the IMF and he got a close look at the symbiotic relationships between the world's economic elites and its governments. In the United States, it goes way beyond mere access or even collusion. He says, Here, the two career tracks of government and high finance are simply melded together. And that is problematic when the oligarchy screws up and the economy implodes. Johnson stresses that when the IMF enters the scene of a crash, the economic part is usually very straightforward. Nations and crises are told to live within their means by increasing exports, cutting imports, and breaking up bankrupt enterprises and banks. Every country in the world that is not the United States would get that prescription. But the U.S. controls the IMF. It has a powerful and very well-connected oligarchy, and it pays its foreign debts in its own currency. And so our recovery began by paying off Wall Street. There are significant differences between the South Korean and Indonesian crash of 1997 and the Malaysian crash the next year, and Japan's lost decade, and the recurrent crashes in Russia and Argentina, and the one we are going through now. But they all have in common the most important thing: a financial oligarchy that rigged the game in its favor, built an empire on debt, overreached in good times, and brought the house down on everybody. When the house collapses, elites do what they always do. They take care of their own. To get a different result, a nation has to take control of the problem and break the grip of the oligarchy. Otherwise, you just muddle along in a lost decade of your own, which further entrenches the oligarchy. Johnson's analysis is strong and compelling on that point, but his prescription is straight out of the IMF playbook. Find a bottom, clear out the clutter, get the fiscal and monetary houses in order, and shake up what he calls crony capitalism. There's always going to be an economic oligarchy, he says, so the best thing we can do is just shake it up from time to time. To this end, he recommends new antitrust laws, although he can't say what they would look like, and he notes that we're probably going to try to cap executive compensation, although he says that won't work. It never does. They always find a way. In his book, 13 Bankers, he makes a case for shrinking the big banks, and a very strong case. If we take the existing system for granted, Johnson's prescription is about the best we can do. It's certainly better than the course that President Obama took. But I want to end by talking about something bolder and more creative: renewing this country with a massive investment in economic democracy. For over 2 centuries, our country has debated 2 fundamentally different answers to the question of what kind of country we should want to be. The first is the vision of a society that provides unrestricted liberty to acquire wealth. The second is the vision of a realized democracy in which rights over society's major institutions are established. In the first view, the right to property is lifted above the right to self-government, and the just society minimizes the equalizing role of government. In the second view, self-government is considered superior to property, and the just society places democratic checks on social, political, and economic power. Both of these visions are ideal types, deeply rooted in U.S. American history, that reflect inherent tensions between classic liberalism and democracy. Both have limited and conditioned each other throughout American history. But in every generation, one of them gains predominance over the other, shaping the terms of debate and possibility, telling the decisive story of its time. Today, an extreme version of the former social vision is being asserted very aggressively. The story of our time, in this view, is about a great people being throttled by a voracious federal government. Americans are overtaxed. Government is always the problem. Somehow the federal government caused the financial crash, and we have a debt crisis because we have too much government. Moreover, keeping taxes low is the key to the success in all of these areas. Leading candidates for president are telling us that America made terrible mistakes by establishing Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and even the progressive income tax. All are variations violations of the American way. I acknowledge that claims of this sort are deeply rooted in American history. The Tea Party did not invent them. But this ideology has no standing whatsoever in the tradition of social ethics advocated by the ecumenical Protestant and Catholic churches in this country. Here we begin with the principles that we owe obligations to each other and that there is such a thing as the common good. For those of us who stand in this tradition, I think it's imperative to say these three things among and amid today's policy debates. One, Americans are not overtaxed. This year, the total tax burden reached its lowest point since 1958. In 1999, Americans spent 28% of their income on federal, state, and local taxes, which was the usual amount going back to the early 1970s. Today, it's 23%. As a percentage of GDP, American taxation is at its lowest level today since 1950, 14.8%. Two, this is how we got so deeply in debt. If we had stuck with the Clinton tax rates, our national debt today would be minimal or non-existent. Our nation's debt exploded because during the Bush years, we cut the marginal rate and capital gains taxes without paying for either one. We established a drug benefit that we didn't pay for, and we fought two wars that we didn't pay for either. These expenditures doubled the nation's debt in 7 years, and that record keeps mounting, accounting for 3/4 of the new debt that have accumulated during Obama's presidency. Most of the remaining new debt is cleanup for the financial crash. Today, the wealthiest Americans pay minimal income taxes owing to the favors that Washington showers on the super wealthy. Investment managers earning billions per year are allowed to classify their income as carried interest, which is taxed at the same rate as capital gains, 15%. Constantly, we are told that the investor class would lose its zeal for making money if it had to pay taxes on its actual income, or if the capital gains rate were raised. But there is no evidence whatsoever for that claim. No investor passes on a promising investment because of the tax rate on a potential gain. Warren Buffett says, I haven't met a single one in 50 years. A tax system that serves the common good would have additional brackets for the highest incomes, as the U.S. once did. It would have a bracket for $1 million earners, and a bracket for $10 million earners, and a bracket for $100 million earners, and so on. It would lift the cap on the Social Security tax, which is all we have to do to make Social Security viable for another century, taxing salaries above $102,000 per year, or creating a donut hole that at least adds an extra Social Security tax if you make more than $500,000 a year. 3, tax rates are not the most important factor contributing to economic growth. Creating a healthy and productive workforce is way more important than these fluctuations in tax rates that we spend our political campaigns arguing about. Educating the workforce for 21st century jobs and investing in research and technology are far more important. Sustaining a middle class that buys goods and services is more important. Developing a strong infrastructure, the U.S. now ranks 23rd in the world, or saving for investment, most Americans have no savings, are as important as tax rates. Today we're caught in a deflationary spiral. Deflation, once started, has a terrible tendency to feed on itself. Income falls in a recession, which makes debt harder to bear, which discourages investment, which further depresses the economy, which leads to more deflation. Businesses are holding back because they lack customers, not because they lack confidence in the government. The economy is sluggish because of weak consumer demand caused by stagnant wages, job uncertainty, and the ongoing ravages of the mortgage disaster and the crash. If we opt for muddling through a lost decade of our own, we can savage the public sector unions, as the Cameron government in Britain has just done, and we can slash Medicaid and Medicare, being proposed. The alternative is to renew the country by making massive investments in clean energy economy. Labor costs, equipment costs, and the cost of capital will never be lower than they are right now. The U.S. has underinvested in infrastructure for decades. A national infrastructure bank, once created, would get serious money plowed into infrastructure rebuilding on an ongoing basis, not just subject to the cycle of Congress. If we can spend trillions of taxpayer dollars bailing out banks and eating the toxic debts of AIG and Citigroup, we ought to be able to create good public banks at the state and federal levels to do good things. Public banks could finance startups in green technology that are currently languishing and provide financing for cooperatives that traditional banks spurn. They could support small businesses that the mega banks dismiss. They could be financed by an economic stimulus package approved by Congress, or by claiming the good assets of banks seized by the government. We seized 3 or 4 every Friday, or both. Or they could be established at the state level. Today, the only state in this country that isn't reeling from the credit crunch is, as some of you know, North Dakota. Why? It's the only state that has its own bank. North Dakota has its own credit machine, which makes it less dependent on Wall Street. Recently, the state of Washington has voted to establish a state bank, and currently there are significant movements to establish state banks in this state and Illinois, Michigan, Virginia, Missouri, New Mexico, Vermont, half a dozen others. If these movements succeed, they will be a huge step in the direction of economic democracy. Economic democracy is about extending the values and rights of democracy into the economic sphere and creating environmentally sustainable economies. In its full org version, it features mixed forms of worker, community, and mutual fund or public bank enterprises. I don't believe that the factors of production trump everything. But I do believe that those who control the terms, amounts, and direction of credit have an enormous say in determining and creating the kind of country that the rest of us end up living in. We are getting a dramatic demonstration of that today. Gains toward economic democracy are needed for the same reason we need political democracy, to restrain the abuse of unequal power. People work harder and more efficiently when they have a stake in the company, when it's their company. In Spain, the Mondragon network is spectacularly successful. In the US, we have 14,000 firms with worker ownership plans, and approximately 1,000 which are fully worker-owned, though we have nothing like a network of cooperatives like Mondragon is. These are building blocks for a movement. On the way to a serious movement, economic democracy is about building up institutions that don't belong wholly to the capitalist market or to the state. It begins by expanding the sector of producer and consumer cooperatives, community land trusts, and community finance corporations. But I believe that merely expanding the cooperative sector is not enough. Cooperatives usually prohibit non-working shareholders, so they attract less outside financing than capitalist firms. They're committed to keeping low-return firms in operation, which is a virtue, but that means they stay in business even when they can't afford to pay competitive wages. They're committed to particular communities, a huge virtue, but that does make them less mobile. They smack of anti-capitalist bias, so they have trouble getting advice and consulting and money from banks. They maximize net income per worker rather than profits, so they tend to favor capital-intensive investments over job creation. All these problems can be mitigated with tax incentives. But I think we also need something bolder and more visionary. We need forms of social ownership that facilitate democratic capital formation, that have greater capacity for scaling up, and are more entrepreneurial. Specifically, that means public banks and mutual funded holding companies. This approach can take a variety of forms, but the essential idea is to establish competing banks or holding companies in which the ownership of productive capital is vested. The companies lend capital to enterprises at market rates of interest, and otherwise they control the process of investment, including making the tough decisions. Equity shareholders, the state, and or other cooperatives own the holding companies or the public banks. This model contains a built-in system of wage restraints, and it facilitates new forms of capital formation. It requires no program of nationalization. This has nothing to do with nationalization, and investors still seek the highest rate of return. It doesn't rest on idealistic notions about human nature, and it does not need a blueprint. I have theories and favorite models to push. I developed them in that book that came out last year. But the key thing is to expand the social market in different ways and find out which ones work in particular circumstances. Most of our traditions in social theory and Christian social ethics have operated with unitary ideas about something called capitalism or socialism, as though each were only one thing. Economic democracy has to be something built from the ground up, piece by piece, opening new choices, breaking from the universalizing logic of state socialism, taking seriously that there are different kinds of capitalism. The tests are pragmatic. To impose something like the Mondragon network on American society would require coercion over workers who don't want to belong to cooperatives. Today, in the U.S. Pacific Northwest, there's a famous network of long-standing, highly successful plywood cooperative firms. Out there, some plywood workers choose to work in conventional firms instead of the cooperatives. No political economy worth building ever would force them into a different choice. But the issue of choice is the key to a better alternative. A politics that expanded the cooperative and social ownership sectors would give workers important new choices. The central conceit of neoclassical economics could be turned into a reality. The textbook conceit is that capitalism doesn't exploit anyone, because labor employs capital as much as capital employs labor. But in the real world, the owners of capital nearly always organize the factors of production. To expand the cooperative and social market sectors would give choices to workers that classical textbook economics promises, but almost never delivers. It would show that there is an alternative to a system that stokes and celebrates greed and consumption to the point of self-destruction. I'm coming home here. The Earth's ecosystem cannot sustain a U.S. American level lifestyle for more than 1/6 of the Earth's population. The economy is physical. There are limits to economic growth. Global warming is melting the Arctic ice cap at a shocking pace, as well as large areas of permafrost throughout the world. Everything that's frozen on the planet is melting, destroying wetlands and forests throughout the world. A century ago, the newly founded Federal Council of Churches issued an historic pronouncement called the Social Creed of the Churches. The churches could not agree on doctrine. That's why there were 32 denominations in the Federal Council. But the social gospel leaders of the Federal Council reasoned that the churches should be able to agree about social justice and actually do something for it. So the very first thing they did, they barely existed for a week when they issued the Social Creed, which advocated equal rights and complete justice for all human beings, the abolition of child labor, a living wage as a minimum in every industry, social security, an equitable distribution of income and wealth, the abatement of poverty, and 8 other planks focused mostly on economic justice. Well, all that sounded contemporary enough. Maybe we should have just reprinted it. But a century later, the National Council of Churches does have a new social creed. I was one of the half-dozen people who wrote it. It calls for full civil, political, and economic rights for women and men of all races. It demands the abolition of forced labor, human trafficking, and the exploitation of children. It supports employment for all at a family-sustaining living wage with equal pay for comparable work. It stands up for the right of workers to organize. It opposes the death penalty. It calls for the abatement of hunger and poverty. And it endorses universal health care, Social Security, and progressive tax policies. It commends immigration policies that protect family unity and foster international cooperation. It stresses the necessity of adopting simpler lifestyles, living within our means, protecting the Earth's environment, and investing in renewable energy. It supports equitable global trade that protects local economies and advocates a foreign policy based on international law and multilateral diplomacy. It calls for nuclear disarmament, reductions in military spending, and the abolition of torture. And it calls for cooperation and dialogue among the world religions. It is not an easy thing to get a statement like this through the National Council of Churches. Every line in this social creed has a story behind it. Maybe someday I'll write that one. For many years, we have needed a social movement that demands that we break the Wall Street oligarchy. And now suddenly we have one. In some ways, Occupy Wall Street is not the movement that many of us have wanted for 30 years. It's rooted in anarchist theory and strategy. It has no analysis of corporate capitalism or theory of a constructive alternative to it. So far, it has no demands at all. But the conventional activist groups that have demands and agendas produced nothing like a movement. The organizers of Occupy Wall Street would not have succeeded had they operated like conventional trade unions and the social justice groups that I belong to. They are building, and it's not just they, I'm part of this now, they are building a social movement that prizes radical democracy, radical hospitality, and a distinct blend of nonviolence and outrage, which is tough to pull off, but they are doing it. They are building a global protest community that is transformative in the lives of those who have joined it. And the long-term success of this movement depends on its ability to build constructive coalitions with the very groups that initially spurned it. For the occupiers, it's more important to sustain a spirit of rebellion than to agree on what the government should do about derivatives or tax justice. Occupy Wall Street is not a progressive organization. It's a social movement with a radical democratic ethos. The organizers understand that making government policy is never going to be their job anyway. Their job is to raise hell about a system that has turned American society into a pyramid and made a mockery of American democracy. They are building a social movement that practices egalitarian, leaderless, direct democracy. Coalitions are forming that were not possible 2 months ago. I believe that the organizers were right to concentrate on building a social movement and not issuing a list of demands. Any policy prescription would have been divisive and disabling in the early going. I also believe that sooner or later, of course, this movement's going to have to make some policy demands. And I hope that it will opt for economic democracy when it does so. But however that may turn out, I am certain that Occupy Wall Street has set off something that's already too big not to make a difference. Wall Street is by far the most powerful force in our nation's economic and political life. It requires a certain stubbornness and moral outrage to set yourself against something that powerful. But if the stubborn types can seize this terrible moment as an opportunity to build a better social